Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here. In this video, we're going to talk about the best ways to split up your lifting if you are pursuing hybrid training. Because if you want to build both your strength and endurance at the same time, then not all ways of structuring your lifting are going to be as effective or as practical or realistic for that matter. So as always, here's the plan and the talking points for the video. We'll first talk about resistance training or strength training, volume and frequency, because that's kind of a necessary prerequisite for everything else to talk about after. Although we're not going to spend too much time there, just talk about what you need to know for the splits here. We'll then talk about full body training, upper lower split training, and then a full body upper lower sort of combination, why you might choose one over the other, and why these are, in my opinion, your best options for hybrid training. And then we'll talk a bit about why other typical splits of lifting are not going to be as effective or realistic for hybrid pursuits. So when you're measuring resistance training volume, so how much of it you're doing, the best means to measure it, the most effective means to measure it, is by the number of sets taken 1 to 3 reps shy of failure per muscle group per week or per movement if you're talking about strength per se. So this definition here, the 1 to 3 reps shy of failure, getting close to failure, excludes all of your warm-up sets as being part of your training volume for the week. And then that's your unit. So if we're talking about more of a muscle growth oriented sort of approach, a barbell back squat would count as 1 set per week for the quadriceps, glutes, lower back, adductors, and various other things for that matter. Whereas 1 set of leg extensions is going to count for only 1 set per week for the quadriceps. So that's your unit. You add that up across the week and you measure that out, and that's how you define your volume for the week. For hypertrophy or muscle growth, the minimum effective dose, which is what MED stands for, is typically said in most papers to be about 4 sets per muscle group per week. 2 sets of reverse lunges at some point in the week, and then 2 sets of squats at another point in the week, both of which were taking 1 to 3 reps shy of failure, or all 4 of which, rather, I should say. You would see reliable growth in your quadriceps and your glutes over time. That would be enough of a stimulus to produce that. Now, again, still speaking about muscle growth specifically, not necessarily strength here, doing more volume tends to be noticeably better than doing less, but there is a diminishing rate of return. So if you were to go to from 4 sets per week to 6 sets per week for a given muscle group, that would bring you more benefit than going from 6 to 8 and so on. For strength specifically, the numbers tend to be a bit lower than what's reported for muscle growth. So to reliably improve your strength over time, the minimum effective dose tends to be reported at 2 to 3 sets per week. And the same relationship, whereas more being better tends to be true, but the ceiling is much lower in the sense that the maximum benefit you're likely to get is going to be found at a lower number of sets per week than it is for muscle growth. And now again, building muscle and building strength are for the most part the same adaptations. There are some sort of nuance and some specifics to how you would program it if you want to optimize for one or the other. And then there's also some differences in how they are studied and what movements are studied in these papers that produce these numbers. But the overarching point that I seek to make with all this information here is that this minimum effective dose for, let's say, hypertrophy, muscle growth, because that is the higher of the two, that's very easy to hit with not that much lifting across the week. The sweet spot, if I had to say there was any, in my opinion, for both strength and muscle growth, which usually there's some sort of combination of pursuits of the two, is going to be about 6 to 12 sets per week for most people from a perspective of maximizing results, but also maximizing just, the time you have in the gym per se. In other words, going from 12 sets per week to 15 or 18 sets per week might give you a little bit more, but it might not give you enough more, or if that's how you would say that, but enough extra in order to justify the extra effort to do it, especially when you take into account the idea that you might want to pursue other pursuits of fitness apart from just muscle growth, such as things like power, endurance, things of the sort. With regard to strength training frequency or resistance training frequency, that is just a function of how your total weekly volume is split up across the week. So if you're going to do 10 sets per week for a given muscle growth, your frequency would be whether you do that all 10 sets in one session, across 2 sessions, or across 3 sessions, or however it ends up being split up across the week. The research on this topic tends to suggest that training muscle 2 times per week or splitting your total weekly volume up into 2 different sessions per week tends to outperform doing it all in 1 session per week, with the sort of rationale being that your average set quality tends to be a bit higher, because you're doing 10 sets per chest per week as your designated training volume for the chest, and you're doing all 10 sets in 1 session. By the time you get to that 10th session, your chest is cooked and you're probably not going to be able to put out too high quality of a set. But if you split that up into 2 different sessions across the week and you are bringing a much fresher you into those 5 extra sets across the week, you're going to have a much higher average set quality than if you did all 10 in 1 session. Training a muscle 3 to 4 times per week or anything above 2 doesn't usually, I should say, outperform training a muscle 2 times per week. So The main point there is that a good training split, and this isn't even just for hybrid training, this is just for lifting in general for this statement, is that a good training split should train a muscle at least 2 times per week. And then the other main point here is that the minimum effective dose can be very easily met with just 2 days of lifting per week. And I'm going to talk about doing more, but the point is much more is possible with much less than you may have previously thought. So the first split of training that I'm going to recommend that is most appropriate for hybrid pursuits is going to be full body training. Now, this is where you train every or most muscle groups in a single session, and in every session across the week, that is. Now, I tend to like this training split for, just about everyone, honestly, mostly because of this point right here, that is the most practical lifting split you can follow. If your training volume is split up into 3 lifts across the week, and then life happens, you have to miss one of those sessions, you don't lose out on 50% or 100% of your total training volume for any given movement or muscle. You have enough volume elsewhere that you can still reliably make progress in that week, and it's just not that big a deal. So it works very well with almost everyone's life. It also does not place any limitations on what exercises can be reasonably programmed, because, for instance, something like a normal deadlift is going to be a full body exercise in and of itself. There's very few muscles in the body that aren't being notably stimulated in a movement such as that. Obviously, the same is going to be true for things like Olympic lifting. Now, this isn't a training split you're going to be doing 4 times per week, because that would at some point require you to do a full body training 2 days in a row, which in my opinion isn't the best of practices. But the result of that is that it leaves the most time available for endurance training compared with any other split. And it's going to pair pretty well with any endurance pursuit you want to go after, whether it's a short distance goal, a long distance goal, a triathlon, a Spartan, a high rocks, a run, whatever it is you are after, what you're trying to pursue is going to blend pretty well with full body training. And that's also a function of the fact that the fatigue you feel in any given part of your body from lifting specifically is going to be spread out pretty uniformly across the week. So you're never really beat down too much where you can't put out a good quality endurance session the next day or something of the sort. Now, at its most time efficient for someone who wants to make good notable progress with both their strength and their endurance over a long period of time, you could do 2 full body lifts and 2 endurance sessions per week and see great results with that if you are consistent with that over time. At its sort of most time consuming, where you're training every single day of the week, you could do 3 full body lifts, let's say on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then 4 endurance sessions in the week, where on every other day that you're not doing lifting. And then to get a little more creative, you could have, let's say, a strength and an anaerobic conditioning sort of day. So maybe you have a couple of your main lifts on a Monday, and you finish off that day with a couple max effort bouts on the rower, 2 other full body strength days that are just normal lifting days, and then let's say 1 to 2 there, because you already have this one here, and then 2 to 4 endurance sessions across the week on your other days of the week. And now with anything, there are 100 different ways you can get creative and make this blend better with your goals in your life and things of the sort. But hopefully this paints the picture of why this tends to blend very well with hybrid pursuits. And actually, just before we move on into the upper lower split discussion, if you were to do, let's say, 3 sets per muscle group or per movement of interest, if you're more strength oriented in your lifting goals, that puts you at 9 sets per week per muscle or per movement, whatever you're after, which is, again, in my personal opinion, in my experiences working with people, that tends to be right in the middle of the sweet spot as far as lifting volume is concerned. So upper lower split training involves training upper body 2 times per week and lower body 2 times per week. So you're kind of fixed at 4 lifts per week with this split. And now the main pro of this one is that it's obviously easier to push the volume in lifting a bit more because you just have more time available to do it. And I think there is something to be said about the idea that over time you bias certain qualities of your fitness over time, and you can sort of cycle that through. So let's say you are 60% lifting focused and 40% endurance focused, and then 1, 2, 3 months later you switch that, you go back and forth. If you find yourself in a period where you want to pursue or prioritize muscle growth specifically, and I say that as opposed to something like strength power, but you still want to take a hybrid pursuit to your training overall, this might be your best bet, because again, volume is going to be a bigger player for something like muscle growth as it is compared to strength. And now, in my opinion, though, this split tends to be harder to pair with longer distance endurance goals, just because you end up having to train a lot. If that's the case, something like, at least, if you're pursuing something like a half marathon or a marathon and you're doing an upper lower split, you might be looking at, 1 to 2 a days, or at least every day of the week or something like that. With shorter distance endurance goals, though, you can use much less volume toward your endurance training, use a bit higher intensity and still recover just fine. And then just from a time management perspective, that tends to make a bit more sense, in my opinion, at least, with muscle growth as a goal, if you are going to dedicate a bit more time and more volume toward that. And, this also presumes you have a fixed number of time in the week that you can dedicate towards training, which most people do. And now, again, like I said, if you want to make reliable progress in your endurance at the same time following this split, you're going to want to be training at least 6 days per week. So you have 2 true endurance sessions in the week, sometimes even 7, or it could be, 2 let's say full endurance sessions and one, short 15, 30-minute bike ride, like a, easy zone 2 recovery type of day. And then again, you can get creative where you sort of mix it into your lifting a little bit to sort of get the volume in there somewhere. But that can, I can ramble on forever about that. And then here are just some example structures of what this might look like across the week. So you could do, let's say, lower body on Tuesday and Saturday, and upper body on Thursday and Sunday. Or you could do lower body on Monday and Thursday, and upper body on Tuesday and Friday. Now, a full body, lower body, upper body training split is one that I think can be pretty fun to run because it's going to let you train a lot of those more complex, true full body movements, like let's say a true conventional deadlift or Olympic lifting or something of that sort. You can have that sort of, true strength focus on a Monday. And let's say on a Thursday and Friday, you have a bit more of like a bodybuilding focus, which again, they're going to complement one another because strength and muscle growth are largely the same adaptation. Now, I do also have another video where I sort of go over an example training week that uses this kind of split that is hybrid in nature. So I'll try and link that up in the top right corner if you're interested in that. But really, the main reason I would say you should select this training split as opposed to a full body training split or an upper lower training split is for if you're trying to do two things. So one, make max effort conditioning a high priority in your programming, or if upper body conditioning is a high priority in your programming. So if you're trying to peak for a 5K run and you're trying to put out your best possible effort on a 5K run and you're in the last week of training for it, then max effort conditioning might be pretty high on the list of things that are high priority trainings for you. Or let's say you're doing a triathlon is what you're training for, or swimming is part of what you're trying to get better at. Upper body conditioning tends to be easy to program in this type of split. So let's say you're following this structure up here. So you're doing full body on Monday, lower body lifting on Thursday, and then upper body strength on Friday. You could do a low intensity, low heart rate, lower body conditioning type of day. So let's say a bike or a run or something of the sort on Tuesday after the full body day. On Wednesday, you could program a swim, and then that's going to give you a day of rest for your upper body in between the full body day on Monday and the upper body day on Friday, which I think for upper body conditioning tends to be make a bit more sense because your legs are just a bit more primed to handle that sort of back-to-back volume than your arms are. They just don't have the aerobic cardiovascular machinery that your legs have. And then on Saturday, you could put in the max effort conditioning. So that whether that's true high intensity interval training or just max effort running of some other kind. You would then have a day of rest in between for your legs between the lower body strength on Thursday and the full body strength on Monday. So you should feel pretty good going into. So again, the previous training splits we talked about before are the most practical for hybrid training, in my opinion, because they allow enough time in the week to provide enough volume for both strength and endurance across the week. And every muscle group or movement is going to be trained at least 2 to 3 times per week. With something like a push-pull legs split, the only way you'd be able to train each muscle group or movement 2 times per week is if you're lifting 6 days per week, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it makes endurance training much more difficult to pair because just from a time management perspective. If you look at a push-pull legs upper lower, which is what I mean to say with this one right here, that fixes it a little bit by bringing your lifting days down to 5 days per week instead of 6 days per week. But again, the only way you can make reliable progress with your endurance at the same time is if you are training every single day, so 7 days per week, or if you're willing to get very creative with how you're structuring these lifts and like if you're mixing some endurance within here. And then the bro split, which is the idea of having like a chest day, a back day, shoulder day, leg day, things like that. You're really only able to train each muscle group truly 1 time per week. And even doing that, you're left with almost no time to dedicate towards endurance training. So I think bro splits just make, in my opinion, no sense for hybrid pursuits. And if you are someone who is trying to build your strength and endurance at the same time, the only splits that I would recommend are full body splits, upper body, lower body splits, or a combination where it's a full body, lower body, upper body going of some kind. So I'm going to wrap this video up right here. I hope you found that somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere in between. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about anything I said, don't hesitate to comment them down below, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Hope you have a good one, and I will speak to you soon.